Welcome to the meeting.
Okay.
So let's see. What did you get? Z, do you have any updates?
Yeah, I'm writing papers for the project we talked about the writing that. Still got a lot of say questions because it is pretty hard to design that such genetic algorithm. Actually, I bring a question to the meeting today, which is so the lateral inhibition in retina it's kind of like it can be modeled by say using a filter on say an image.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering like if I'm going to use the genetic algorithm to say to find the optimal filter. Um, I'm just wondering how can I encode that such matrix of filter because the matrix can be of different size. Yeah.
Well, that's a good question. I wonder. It sounds like maybe people have done this before. First thing I would do is like kind of look around and see if people have done like something, on in terms of like, I don't know what the topic would be. Maybe like just image, like just with standard image processing. Because even like maybe 10 or 15 years ago, people were doing stuff with, pre-machine learning. They were doing stuff with image processing, and I can look into some things for you to see if there's something out there. But like people have done things like select on different features and select on different shades of color in the image. So it might be something that exists. It might not be. Because I don't know like if people have thought of that specific problem. In terms of like my recommendations on how to do it, kind of like what I just said, which is like taking like the image and like maybe dividing it into a certain number of pixels, and then kind of like almost like a machine learning approach where you're kind of defining regions of it and then figuring out like the criterion that you want for the filter and then applying it in a way that's like selecting for that feature or selecting for that shade or feature in the image. So it would be like pixel independent or matrix size independent. It would be depend on like
Yeah.
yeah. I think
Yeah, so the whole image is fixed in size, but the filters are not fixed in size, so it's just encode whole image, right? Is that what you mean?
Yeah. The whole image, or if you could find regions of the image, but it would be like it wouldn't be like a 50 by 50 square. It might be just like if they're a cluster of images that are because like a genetic algorithm is going to have like global and local component, or it's going to have like you can make it so that it can focus on features, it can focus on the whole frame. I'd start out with just treating it as a global problem and just saying, let's see if we can, like select for like pixels that are, a certain shade or select for a certain color value and see if that, provides a nice looking filter or something that we want.
I see.
Yeah. Yeah, I can look up things in the literature. It seems like someone's done this because I know people have done like they've done a lot of work with art, like with selecting what they call aesthetically pleasing objects. So if it's like maybe like you have these sculptures or you have like images of chairs or something like that. People will encode like the chair as like like with the features that they want, or they generate a bunch of variants. That's what they do first, and then they select on certain features and they say, well, this is the one we want for our final population, and we do this over and over. With like image processing, it might be where you just present the algorithm with a bunch of images, kind of like in machine learning, and you say, we want to select for this value, and then it might produce like something that's something that's maybe trained on data, so it would be like data specific as a filter, and then you could apply that. I'm not really sure how it would actually work in practice, but I mean, those are maybe some ideas of how to go. Yeah. Are you trying to evolve like a topology? Like, you trying to see what the retina looks like, or are you just trying to say this is what a retina does?
Yeah, I am going to simulate the evolution process, and so there's a lot of horizontal cells that facilitate the lateral inhibition, and the horizontal cells has a certain receptor field, and the horizontal cell can pave, so can have its layout in mammals is like very mosaic. That means there's a very organized grade, and so basically they just pay very compactly. I just like to mimic like how that very nice shape, very nice layout would evolve from random positions, and also like the size of the horizontal cells would matter. So I mean, yeah, I think encode the whole image is going to be a good idea, because the size of the retina is intended to be fixed, and there are horizontal cells in the retina, and each horizontal cell is just responsible for one region. That means there are going to be different size filter like in the retina. So so yeah. I think using encoding image is going to be good.
I know I still haven't sent those materials out on the genetic algorithms, but I'm getting there. So, yeah, good. That sounds good. Well, good luck on that. You have to tell us how it goes.
Yeah, I was doing experiments last week, and I used like RGB images as input, but then I found out that RGB is not going to be effective, because human eyes like perceives using wavelengths, and the different kind of photoreceptors have different kind of sensitivity to different wavelengths.
Yeah.
Therefore, using RGB is like totally not effective at all.
No.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's tricky to get the right kind of thing that will work. Yeah. So I think I mentioned this in the. Oh, Jesse, do you have anything to add to that, or did you want to make comments on that?
Not really. It sounds good though.
Yeah. Okay. So I mentioned this during our in an email this week about putting together like a paper for some of the stuff we've done this summer. So I find that it's good to write things up. If you've done some work, just to get like some, it doesn't have to be like every deep dark secret of what you're doing, but like just a general description of what's been going on. So I've got like this. Let me share my screen a little bit here.
Is it an academic paper or just like a report?
Well, right now it looks more like a report. We'll see how it goes, and I don't exactly know where this would go, like in terms of, but like here's what I've got so far. So I've kind of drawn up an outline. So we've got people in the group here, no specific order. I think I alphabetized the authors on this. The title is basically using Bradenberg vehicles as developmental neurosimulation. And then, you need an abstract. Work on that last, actually. I found that that's best because you figure out what you want to write, and then you write the abstract. And then the introduction, it's nothing here that's controversial. We'll have sections like, so why were Bradenberg vehicles selected, and that would be like just kind of like an explanation of why they might be suitable for this approach. And then suitability of Bradenberg vehicles for modeling development. So there's some points here. Neurodevelopment of brain networks. So this kind of gets into the some of the issues with how that might be used to simulate neurodevelopment, or there might be another section on how you might use this in an applied manner. So that area is pretty flexible, though. Then the results, which basically actually consist of two things. So the computational model of developmental neuroscience. Now this is something that we haven't really talked about a lot, but we kind of want to, the idea of this part of the paper is that, we kind of lay out why, what kind of a computational model we might build for, kind of describe it at a very broad level, what might be possible. And then, so I talked to Jesse about, he had an idea about neuroethology and writing some stuff on that, and that actually might be a good place for it.
Yes.
Yeah. But, we can play around with where, the name and everything, but that'd be a good place for that. And then write a little bit about the software instantiation. So right now I have BroadGen Brain, which is what Stefan has been working on, and the multimodal integration stuff Ziyi's been working on. And so all we need to do is to write up maybe several paragraphs to maybe a page or two. I'll do most of the writing on just what, describing the platform and, kind of giving some background. And I don't know if we want to put in some, maybe run it and get some results, but that's, I guess that depends. If we want to make it as an academic paper, we can do that. Or if we want to just keep it as a report, we might just describe it in its state. With academic papers, you'll go to a reviewer and they'll ask you for certain things. So sometimes you have to sometimes you have to fulfill those requirements. But I don't know if they'll ask for, a huge amount of data. I don't think that's what they're going to do, but we'll see. And then there'll be a section on discussion and future plans. So in this section, I guess, we can talk about how we might apply some of these models, especially the software models. And it's something we have to think about a little bit in terms of how would you apply this? Is it something that, would be useful to the community? And then, we talked about use cases, we can talk a little bit about use cases, but, that's something to decide later. And then references, of course, we'll put in references. I haven't put anything in yet, but the references
I recorded all the references I used.
Oh, good.
GitHub page, yeah.
Yeah, that's good.
I have the original paper stored in my laptop.
Okay. Yeah, we can. If you want to, send me something like a summary with some of your references, I guess I can solicit them from people. But if you want to send me something like a summary, that would be good. I don't know how much time you have right now, but
sorry, a summary of references or a summary of
maybe a short summary of your project, how you see it. Is it do you want to give it a name? Do you want to spell out kind of some of the features of it? Maybe provide a screenshot, and then some of the references that you've been referring to, and we can put them into the description. So that would be good. Yeah. And then
about the section of multi-model integration, what do you expect to
so that's just a stand-in for your project. If you want to call it something else, you can. But
okay, so that's not a straight topic, right?
No, it's not. It's just the software instantiation. I don't think we need to cover a lot of background on. Well, we may need to cover a little bit of background on it, but we'll see when we get there, because you'll have references for the little write-up, and then we can fit the other references in. It's at this stage, it's really an outline. There isn't much there, but it's once we get into it, we'll see what we need. But we'll definitely need like a write up for the project. So, and then as for Jesse, if you want to, like you mentioned about your neurodevelopment or your neuroethology stuff, we could fit it into the neurodevelopment and brain network section.
Yeah, that sounds good.
Yeah, and then again, like give me the references, and then like in your case, it'd be a bit longer write up, but I mean, we can work on. Just don't worry about like getting it perfect. We can work on the editing, getting it in place, because sometimes when you write papers, it takes a bit of work to go through it and read it a couple times to see what works, what fits into the rest of the paper. And
Yes.
okay, so Ziyi has to go in like 10 minutes. So Jesse, just want to let Jesse know so he can start it. He wanted to talk about some of his ideas that he's been working on.
Yeah. Hold on a second here. Let me get on the camera. Yeah. So, kind of, I've been. I'm sort of charting my course forward from here, because I had a useful summer. It was just a little bit atypical. So I kind of started by looking at my proposal again, and originally I was like, I wouldn't have had to change it, but looking at it again, I feel pretty comfortable with its original thrust of, kind of the original feeling about it was this sense of looking at ways to identify or sort of toggle or at least discuss different layers of cognitive development and different layers of architecture that would support that in terms of a straight cognitive thing, but also sort of the physical components to what would allow that to happen. And I feel like that's still something that I want to do, but I've realized that for me, in order for me to do that, I want to do a more expanded, let's say, literature review or just review of what's out there, because I feel like I want to get to a place where I have a very specific set of things that I want to break down into a brain vehicle, into the toy model. And it feels like I want a little bit more context for that. And one of the biggest things that are most promising areas for that for me has been looking at some papers and some background on early neocortex development and kind of comparative models, if you will, of how that happened in different species or in a sort of evolutionary sense. And I'm finding a little bit on that front. I found a couple of papers that speak to that, and that's promising for my aims. And then generally looking at more about neuroethology and looking maybe at some computational neuroethology stuff. I haven't seen too much from that, but at the very least, neuroethology as a field has been fruitful too. Other things, I kind of like what I said before about looking at what I want to find. I would like to get to a point where I can break down things to kind of specific groups of, okay, sensory motor inputs and outputs and interact with the environment, and specifically looking at ability to model, how they would affect modeling capacity. This is kind of where it seeps into the every good regulator stuff.
Yeah.
And one component of what I would do eventually is kind of have a specific, analysis of how modeling capacity is affected, how it affects the ability to regulate the environment and perceive the environment too. So it's kind of a longer term goal of that. And I did mention, in a more specific sense, looking at specific anatomical features in the development, how they might affect things too. Like the claustrum, I know it's kind of a mysterious, thing we're still trying to figure out how it works, and if there's any kind of data that could be used to actually, anything that could be interpreted for that kind of stuff. But maybe not the classroom itself, but specific, interesting pieces of neuroanatomy that facilitate the stuff that I'm interested in looking at those more specifically.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of the what I just said is sort of what I want to cast my net around in terms of I'm in a phase of looking at these in literature about them, so that way I can eventually get to my kind of what it is I want to break down into use in a brain-brain vehicle why they'd be useful to deal with what I'm looking at there. And let's see. Yeah, actually, I skipped ahead in what I was going to say, but that's pretty much it. I'm very interested in seeing how these could be kind of broken down into some simple categories and how they would affect ability to. It would be really great to get to a point where I could have a very simple, here's a few different, 1, 2, 3, 4 very simple stages of development and creating some genetic algorithm for specific variations with them and seeing how that would develop over time. And a bonus would be trying to figure out interesting ways to incorporate like environmental interactions, certain resource interactions, or if I get to the point, even getting to a point where other actors have interactions. So we'll see. That's more down the road, but that's where I'd like to go with it eventually.
Yeah.
I see.
So, Ziyi, did you have anything to ask?
I think that is very interesting, but I'm not really familiar with cognitive level stuff in neuroscience and also computation neuroscience. So I basically learn and do things in sensation and stuff. But I have a very interesting book, and there's an online version, and there's a whole chapter of like cognitive modeling and decision and stuff. That is computation neuroscience stuff. So probably you will be interested in looking at it. I'll send you the link via the chat.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Do you know the title of it?
Sorry?
Do you know what it's called?
Neurodynamics. I sent you.
Yeah.
That is the link.
Neuronal dynamics.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, yeah. Okay, thank you. Oh yeah, and one specific criteria that I would really like, I don't know, just something to kind of mention and might come back to it in other meetings is looking at the trade-off between how the trade-off between as a, let's say, cognitive architecture develops the trade-off between its ability to, more robustly or more in-depthly model versus what the inherent constraints of the model sort of write off. Like, if you develop in a certain way, you can't develop in other ways. The sort of opportunity cost. Yeah. And I feel like that would be that's something I'm interested in working towards maybe more formal ways of how to study and qualify that. That might lead me to some like complexity theory stuff, but that's it's on topic, I guess.
Yeah.
But yeah, having sort of a metric for that, or getting like, if I could through my research eventually get to a place where I could speculatively write out, okay, here's a way to categorize that, or if anybody knows something like that, let me know. But otherwise, that's kind of my. This is kind of charting the course for where I want to go next. I'll put it that way.
Yeah.
That's all.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, that's a very interesting project. So I probably have to leave.
Okay.
So have a nice week.
Yeah. Thanks for attending. Talk to you soon.
Take care, Ziyi.
Take care, Ziyi.
Yeah.
So Jesse, let's talk more about this stuff. So it's good, and thank you. I was reading your thing yesterday, and I was like, he's in pretty good shape. I mean, he's got a lot of good ideas, but we have to like kind of figure out how to maybe turn them into things like things people can read and things like that.
Yes.
Like like so I talked about a review paper. We might do that, and then I talked about this NeuroSim manuscript. So we have a couple of sections that we might want to put. And I think a lot of the stuff you're talking about with some of the cybernetics, like specific cybernetics questions that you kind of set out, I think those are good. Maybe to frame the paper.
Yeah. I well, I'm curious about the paper that you mentioned because I feel like there's definitely going to be. I don't know if it's going to be how I guess academic it will be. Well, I'm totally fine with doing it because but I definitely want to do some kind of review paper for my own purposes. I feel like I need to do that. And then the one you brought up today, that looks very interesting. And I know that in what I said today, my scope was very, very wide. So I will look to for some what would be appropriate to fit in my section of the paper.
Yeah.
For sure.
Yeah, definitely. I think like we could do both. I mean, that's kind of that's fine because we have a lot of I think there's a lot of stuff here to explore, and it's probably more than one paper. I can tell you. I mean, because it's a pretty wide net. But let me kind of go through. So the last thing you mentioned was the cognitive architectures that is kind of like that explores like a trade-off of the ability to model and the inherent constraints of the model. So that's interesting because you have on the one hand you have you're talking about models, and this is something that I don't think too many people have really kind of explored, especially with relation to cognitive modeling. At least as far as I know, I don't really know the literature intimately, but and then there's also the issue of like constraints in development. And so, like, there are something called developmental constraints, which are really kind of like the idea that if you have a bunch of organisms and they go through development, they don't really go anywhere. They don't like become. They have a lot of plasticity, initially. So we're all come from little embryos or little balls of cells, and then we become very asymmetrical organisms. But we don't just explore that space just at random. We go from a ball of cells to what most humans look like, with a head and a torso and everything. So, like getting to that, you have what they call developmental constraints, and that is that even though you start out at one place, your genome encodes like changes that don't allow you to say sprout wings. I mean, I mean, you can do like there's sometimes people like there's a museum in England where they have a bunch of like strange mutants, like pictures of people who had like mutations, like they have like fangs and things like that, and really long fangs and things like that. But by and large, the changes you don't really see a lot of like huge changes to the developmental plan. So there's that issue.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, okay. What were you gonna say?
I was in a conversation with some of my biology friends recently, and they were saying it's kind of fits what you're saying in that even when there is sort of a mutation, it's maybe not like you get an extra finger and you don't get an eye coming out of your finger socket. It's kind of like specifically, it's not like you're growing an entire brain out of your finger. It's kind of constrained even in that function. So yeah.
Yeah, that's true, and that's kind of the point, and then a lot of it is like because we have the way development happens, so you get like a bunch of cells, and then there are signals that tell those cells how to differentiate. There's also some genetic component to it, like what's possible in terms of the genetic program. But then, you don't, like, there's this idea of what they call the hopeful monster, which is this sort of thought experiment that's like, if you can generate a bunch of, like, say, frogs, and, like, the frogs, you'll see a lot of variation in the frogs, maybe, like, so maybe even things like eyes being copied, like, so you'll have 4 eyes instead of 2. But you shouldn't expect that, like, the frog will, like, start growing feathers and, like, a pair of wings. That really isn't something that will happen, or if it does, it'll happen over many generations. And so that's sort of the idea of the hopeful monster, and we don't really know of any examples of that. But it's like a thought experiment as to, like, why don't you see these big changes? So that's definitely an issue that's interesting, but also, like, then we have this thing about the ability to model, which I think is something that people don't consider enough. So, we think that, well, it's pretty easy to model biology, right? That's not really true, of course. We have a lot of variables that are there that don't. First when you think about modeling, you think about, like, an abstraction, right? So you have an abstraction which is like, I don't want to model everything in the cell or everything in the organism. I want to pick things that are, like, important, So with Bradenburg vehicles, we're picking, like, we have a vehicle that does things that are kind of like a nervous system, but it's this, and it's some silly representation of it. It's in a vehicle. So, like, but then the ability to model, as I understand it, is, like, what can we even know from a model? Like, is it possible even to model mechanisms that we really don't understand very well? Or conversely, is it something that we can get a good, like, can we get a good result on by modeling it? Or is it something that, maybe we need to not even include it in our model and we could be just as well off? So, like, again, the Bradenburg vehicle doesn't really have, like, synaptic proteins in it. Well, we know those are kind of important for the brain. On the other hand, we can get a decent result without having to model that. And so, yeah.
I really feel like part of what inspired me to go this route is because I do think a lot of even just sticking to things like, okay, neocortex development, or very simple, very, very breaking down brain anatomy is a very simple, like system anatomy and very simple components. I feel like there's I feel like there's a lot of important things that can be reduced down, even just the most conceptual sense, into the toy models like this. And it's like, I just want to know, I feel like I need to just go into it a little bit more so that way I can break it back down again, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
There's stuff out there, but it's like, I think I have to go into it so that way I can break it down again.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, like, so some of the ideas, yeah, some of, like, the ability to model, I mean, some of that has not been explored. People have talked about, like, abstraction in, like, this is more of a computer science topic, but yeah.
There's like generative, creating generative, I think it's called generative.
Oh yeah, generative models, yeah.
Like that kind of thing, but it's not, that wasn't exactly, I don't quite know what that is entirely or how it fits in what I'm saying, but I think that's what, like, that's what, like, Josh Chenoweth at MIT is looking on, for, like, how, like, creating, I know he's really interested in creating, how easy it is to look at with minimal effort and minimal training, all these models can happen and develop and going from there. But I don't know if that's quite the same.
Well, yeah, it kind of is related. So, I mean, like, a generative model is like a genetic algorithm qualify. So like the idea is you have a model and you say, on the one hand, you could have a model that just like specifies specific things. Like if you had a genetic representation, you just said, okay, I want to like produce this phenotype from these genes, like a one-to-one mapping. And then you do this, and then that's your model of the, like, I don't know, it's like a beach ball, like a 3D beach ball, and you have like underlying it, you have these little like genes that can code different features of it, like shape. And I mean, that's what we do when we write a program, basically, is that you write a program describing this beach ball, and then the better programs are more compact but include more features, right? So I mean, like, so a beach ball, with that maybe bounces or has like different colors on it. Or now a generative model is different because you want to take your your representation, and you want to generate possibilities out of it. So like that would be like taking encoding the beach ball in a genome, a string of genes, or a string of binary values, and saying I'm going to change some of the values at random so I'm going to mutate the genes, and I want to see what kinds of beach balls I can get. So it's like you get like different colors on it. You get different, maybe even an oblong shape, or maybe a ring, and so you're getting all these options, all these variants. So that's like the generative part of it. Now, it's interesting. I don't know of anyone's really explored this, and maybe it just speaks to my ignorance of like philosophy, but like the generative models, like thinking about it more like in terms of the model than the result.
Yeah, it's something that I don't really know. I don't quite. I'm just thinking about it myself, so we'll see where it goes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's good. I mean, that's what we need to do is kind of discuss it a little bit. So let's see. Then you mentioned you've been talking about like the toggling between different layers of cognitive development. So then you talked about like getting to different stages of development. So you're talking about like you would want to find like a way to sort of model like different stages of development.
I didn't quite hear the last part you said.
Oh,
model what?
Different stages of development. Like you said 3 to 4 stages, so like I assume that's early, middle, and late.
Yeah, or even like that's also in sort of an evolutionary development sense, in terms of like I guess in my mind the original thought was something where I don't quite know. I don't quite know how to specify it yet, but something along the lines of, in a broader evolutionary sense of like different species evolving, I guess. I don't know, a very basic organism to an invertebrate to it could even be like just different stages in mammalian complexity, but just sort of along those lines of, okay, if we added a more advanced neocortex, or if we added a even more developed neocortex, or if we added a other sort of, it's very reduced models of these things, but okay, even in the sense of being able to toggle, like if it has 2 legs or 4 legs, or things, something of that degree of basicness.
Right. Yeah. So, yeah. I don't know if you've ever heard of the video game Spore by Will Wright. It was about maybe 10 years ago.
It's called Spore?
Yeah, Spore. So he did. Yeah. He developed SimCity, and then he said, well, I'm going to try to do like one for life. and it's not really that biologically plausible, but it's interesting. He's got basically this idea that, it's like you go to this alien planet and you see you seed you seed some DNA and then you can grow these organisms, and there's he takes a lot of liberties with the biology of it, but it's basically it really is a nice study in complexity. If you removed all the constraints, what would happen? What do you get? It's interesting from that standpoint, and so it's it just reminded me of that.
I'm looking at it now.
Yeah. So it's that's so I like so you can toggle between different. So there is this idea, of course, in development about body plans. So the idea that you have a lot of mammals have basic body plans. So we're all tetrapods, so we all have 5 limbs, 4 limbs, hind limbs, and a tail. And then some of us have lost the tail, and then even snakes have lost, legs, that sort of thing. So you have this body plan that's just you can work from, that doesn't really change that much. And again, it's a developmental constraint, but it's what happens, what does evolution do? So the toggling idea would be going between different variants, I guess.
Yeah. It's something that, as you may know, my sort of ultimate interest is in what we're talking about, but applied to essentially, I feel like I need a better word than cognitive architecture, but essentially that which allows cognition and our ability to, in our EGRT cybernetics terms, the ability to model and comprehend the world around it. But I feel like there's, especially looking I feel like and maybe this will be something that I break down eventually, but I feel like I do want to really maintain looking at things from an embodied cognition perspective. I don't want to just look at, okay, well, let's, a pure cognitive philosophy. I don't want to look specifically at, just kind of abstract cognitive, I don't know if say cognitive science, but so it's I do want to have a sense of, okay, there's the body and its development clearly affects things too. And that might be incorporating that into a level of development in the sense of a brain-brick vehicle, maybe something that's easy to do, if that makes sense. Okay, well, here's a slightly more advanced body. How would that affect its ability to navigate the environment or whatever? Yeah. So that's kind of why I bring that up.
Yeah, definitely. It'll take a little bit of time to kind of figure out how to do that, but I think it's definitely doable. To get the idea of kind of, well, I know that Rob has been talking about the paper that we wrote on models. So it's people modeling things in their head, and then having models of that are kind of biological. So there have been some people who have talked about the cell is a cognitive thing. There's been some talk about that in the literature, that not that cells are sentient, but that they have cognitive decision making.
One of my friends, his name is Johan. He's a neuroscientist at Boston University. He wrote an interesting piece about how this. It's basically what you guys are saying. He's very much a straight neuroscience guy, but he's interested in a lot of stuff that I am, I guess. And he wrote a piece. I'll put it in the lab somewhere once I find it again.
Okay.
About how the cell is sort of, the creation of the cell is sort of the foundation of intelligence because it's creating its own, internal world apart from the outside, and there's, it's sort of an essential part of. It's sort of like the foundational constraint. There's a limit, and there's there's choices that are made in that process and things that are excluded by nature of it existing and being a thing. So yeah. Anyway, you were saying.
Yeah, well, no, that's good, and I think that's kind of where I was going. I don't know who. Yeah, I've just seen some people make the argument, so I'm not really that in tune to the literature. But I think that's definitely like that. There's also this countervailing view that like we don't want to anthropomorphize things. Like
Mm-hmm.
we don't want to make the cell into like an autonomous agent. I mean, in a complexity sense, cells are autonomous agents because they do things that, like, you can, fit it into an agent-based model and they sort of follow certain rules, and you can get, things like pattern formation. But that's maybe different than what humans are doing in terms of cognition. So and then of course there's a debate there. Yeah. So I mean the other thing is let's see. We talked about yeah, you talked a little bit about early cortex and evolution. So what is it about early cortex that you're interested in specifically?
I'm interested in how, like, I don't know that much about it, to be straight up, but I'm interested in how it's, like, compared to our ancestors, for example, we have a larger neocortex. It seems it's more developed than, 65 million years ago.
Yeah.
It's kind of just tracking what has contributed to its development and what are other examples of in different species. Like, apparently, I don't know, I just saw this in one of my papers. I don't know what it was, but apparently the neocortex actually was in, like, reptilian nervous systems, but I don't know if it developed or if it changed, but, like, that's something that I'm curious about, or even, like, in different mammals, what kind of trajectory they have. Were there any particular of its constraints on what the design of their environment that affected it? And this leads to other questions about mammals and chimps and our ancestors and socializing and other kind of things that would other kinds of interactions that would facilitate that kind of development. So
Yeah, that's something else too that I've been interested in the past. So I can send you some materials on that. There are some papers where they sort of contemplate the sort of the diversity of like neocortex. I mean, basically, from what I understand, it's like it's not expanded in the same way across mammals. You have like this in primates, especially. You have this acceleration of the size, in development, and that's how humans get really big brains. But there is like this basic architecture that you see at the beginning of mammals, like the visual cortex and an auditory cortex, and it kind of goes on like it's conserved in that way throughout the order or throughout the yeah.
I don't know if this is something that I don't know how to look for. I don't know how to look for my question, so I don't know if it exists or not. But one of my questions is there any? Obviously, it's very long ago, so it's hard to say. But is there any indication of how the next emerged as its own thing compared to life before the neocortex versus after the neocortex? Like, what is that transition and how did it happen?
Yeah.
I don't know if that's really something that anybody would ever have access to.
Well, I mean, Yeah, so I mean, neocortex is basically 6-layered cortex. So it's that 6 layers of cortex where you have the columns. You've seen you've heard of that a little bit. Okay. So I mean, yeah, I don't know. We'd have to look in the literature, but I know there's some ideas that people may have about that, but I don't know. Yeah.
That's something that I just started looking at this paper, but it supposedly has kind of what I'm talking about in the sense of it's called the emergence and evolution of mammalian neocortex. It's kind of an appropriate name.
Yeah.
But I don't know why it's not. For some reason, it's not uploading to my thing now. But there we go. But basically, it's supposed to be looking at what I'm talking about, hopefully across, based on the embryonic cerebral cortex of different mammalian species. The data on the difference in gene expression, molecular pathways, and novel cellular interactions that led to these evolutionary advances may also provide insight into the pathogenesis and therapies of human-specific neurocentric disorders. Okay, but I think this might have some what I was talking about, some comparative species analysis.
Yeah.
Anyway,
Yeah, that sounds good. I'll check it out, and yeah, I think
but
that's.
You mentioned you have some papers that sound relevant. Sure.
Yeah, I can send you some papers. So let me get those together, and I'll put them. I'm gonna put everything on Sync, which is that drive that we use. It's kind of like the Dropbox clone. So, let's see. I think that's it for now. Computational neuroethology. I think that's a good area to focus on too. Like in terms of, I think that suits some of your interests, and then it kind of gets into the embodiment issue and.
Yeah, I feel like that's, especially in name, that is very much
what I would like to get at, and I just feel like I
have to explore the literature more because I feel like I haven't seen. I want to find something that has, like, I want to get to the methodology. Like, I know a lot of things I'm talking about right now are very conceptual, and that's great, but I do want to get to like some straight up computational methodology that people are using, and I really haven't found that in some areas, and I may not be able to find that very easily, but there's something about that, like, even if it's not that directly related to what I'm studying, just how it works.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, well, it's at the top of the hour, so I gotta go. Thanks for meeting with me.
It was nice to talk a little more. I know you kind of said, hey, we got time later to do this.
I'm glad that kind of worked out today to get some of that, so I appreciate that.
Yeah, no problem. And we'll kind of go through, they'll send you these materials, and we can kind of go through now and, kind of maybe tackle some of these issues, like, one piece at a time. We'll be contributing to the paper here, and then probably do a review. We'll figure out what the review should be. So, kind of think about, like, I'll go ahead and say, think about a review, like how it might be structured. That would be a next step there. And then we can kind of like pull things together into it. So, yeah. Okay. Yeah, thanks for meeting.
You too.
Yeah, you too.
I can see you Wednesday.
I guess I had some questions for that, but I don't have any specific concrete things other than what I already said in the meeting about. Yeah, I mentioned the Cloudstream, but I don't know if that's going to work. But I'm curious, if you have any ideas that I could potentially use for the ML stuff, feel free to, like mention that too if it comes up. So.
Oh yeah, I will. Yeah, no problem.
Okay. All right. Well, thanks for talking, and I'll see you next week.
Yeah, see you next week.
All right. Bye
All
bye.
right, bye.